We're speaking with Judge Lauren Moore of the Cleveland Municipal Court. Judge, talk to me about what's going on here today. There's a lot of people. What's this all about?
Yes, thank you. This is our third annual Black History event. We are celebrating 70 years since the Brown versus Board of Education decision, and this is one of the ways that we are going to commemorate Black History Month.
Okay. So who do we have here? It seems like a collection of just everybody in Northeastern Ohio.
We do. We have a special program. We have a special film that is being sponsored by a group outside of this state, and we have local panelists who are going to speak on the film.
I think it's kind of interesting to be doing this kind of thing because there's a lot of people that kind of want to erase what happened in years past.
I know. Thank goodness this is not Florida. So in Ohio, we still talk about history. We still talk about things that matter. And the desegregation was one of those pivotal decisions that matter today. So we want to make sure people do not forget.
Well, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, we're speaking with James Hardiman. What is your official title?
I'm an attorney now.
Okay.
I've had various titles over the years, but now I'm a practicing lawyer.
Okay. What's going on here today?
Well, it was 60 years ago, this May 17th actually, that the landmark case of Brown versus Board of Education was decided. In Brown, the Supreme Court ruled that separate was inherent and equal. It was intended to be the death nail for segregated schools. 60 years later, we still have segregated schools. We made some progress, but we haven't got where we want to be. So I think this is just a celebration of what happened 60 years ago and to point us in the right direction so that hopefully we'll be able to keep the ball rolling.
Okay, take me back to 1954. I'm sure you were a lot younger back then. Did you know what was going on with that decision?
Actually, I did. I had a paper route, a plain dealer paper route, and that's when I got to read the paper every day. And I still remember, I think I was 12 or 13, I still remember reading the decision that Plessy versus Ferguson had been overruled, Brown overruled land, that segregated schools are no longer acceptable. So I knew what was going on. I was kind of optimistic that things would take place overnight. And 60 years later, we're still fighting the battle.
Now, did that motivate you to become a lawyer?
Well, that didn't motivate me, but that was one of the factors that I was aware of. I don't believe that a lot of my classmates were as aware. Back in those days, they didn't teach anything about Black history. All we knew was that there was a little black Sambo and that there was slavery. But other than that, we didn't study anything about Brown or various cases. None of its progeny did we even learn about. That was something that was a self-journey for myself and many other people after me.
Now, let's fast forward to the 1970s. I want to say it was around 76, where Cleveland was involved in the desegregation case.
It was a little before that, December 12th of 1973. We filed the lawsuit. It was assigned to Judge Battisti, and it wasn't until 1998 that the case was finally declared ended. I'm still not convinced that the Board of Education and the state did everything they could have and should have done. But I think George White, who was the judge at the time, had gotten to the point where he was simply of the opinion that it was time to move on. Black kids still were not reading properly. There still was segregation in many of the schools. Some of it was housing, not all of it, but some of it was housing. But the bottom line was we made progress, but we didn't get where we anticipated being.
And here we are 60 years later, and we still have problems, don't we?
We still have massive problems. I think the ACLU just came out a month or so ago acknowledging the fact that schools were still segregated after Brown, and will be segregated for the foreseeable future. So, will we see the end? I mean, not in my lifetime. Hoping my children's children will.
Well, thank you, Mr. Hardiman.
Okay.
How many of you have read Brown in the last 10 years? How many? 4 people? 3 people? How many have read Plessy in the last 10 years? Same people?
Just got a walk in.
If you want to get mad all over again, go back and read Plessy. Go back and read Cooper versus Aaron. That's the Little Rock situation where they wouldn't let the kids into the Central High School. Go back and read Brown versus the Board of Education. Most importantly, though you don't have that kind of time, go back and read Reed versus Rhodes. Reed versus Rhodes is the Cleveland School desegregation case, the one that I was involved with, along with Nathaniel Jones, Tom Atkins, Terry Demchek, Michelle Comer, and a number of other distinguished people. What we did is we challenged the status quo in the city of Cleveland, Columbus, Cincinnati, Alliance, and Lorraine. And we learned along the way that even though it was the South that had specific laws that either required or permitted racial segregation, the racial segregation in the major urban areas of Ohio was just as pervasive, just as effective. But what we found is that the boards of education were contending that the segregated schools was de facto segregation. In other words, it was segregation that was the result of neighborhood factors over which they had no control. What we were able to argue and prove was that, yes, they did have control. They had control because they assigned teachers, most of whom that were black, were assigned to black schools. They incorporated neighborhood segregation into the schools. They built schools in such a manner that there would be additional segregation. And some of you may remember, if you don't remember, you may have read about Bruce Klunder. Does that ring a bell with anyone? Back in '64, Bruce Klunder was a young white minister who was attempting to object to the construction of schools in Glenville, laid down behind a tractor, got ran over and killed. I happened to be there. I had just graduated from college, and we were walking around. We went by there, saw the police, saw the dogs, saw the horses, and at that point, it kind of hit home for me. This is real. Segregation is bad. Now, Brown had already been decided, because Brown taught us that Plessy was no longer the law, that separate was inherently unequal. Well, what did that really mean? It meant that there was a piece of paper that said they could not discriminate against students on the basis of their race. But it was a long time after that before that ruling started to have any real meaning. That ruling was 1954. It wasn't until the following year, 1955, when the Supreme Court came out with its all deliberate speed mandate. And southern districts, in spite of the all deliberate speed mandate, in spite of the determination that separate is inherently unequal, engaged in policies of what became known as massive resistance. They would do everything they possibly could, including closing down the schools, so that white students could go to private academies, and black students would either have to go to the public schools where they had no teachers, no funding, no facilities, or not go to school at all. That was kind of the situation we found in Cleveland. We found that Cleveland had a segregation problem. Columbus had a segregation problem. Cincinnati had a segregation problem. It wasn't written, but it was in effect. The schools in those major areas, they were able to assign teachers. They were able to build schools to incorporate segregation into the system. They were able to tell us that they were doing the best thing they possibly could, but the schools were still segregated. And some of you may remember Arnold Pinckney. Does that ring a bell with anyone? Mm-hmm. Arnold Pinckney was the one of the campaign managers for Carl Stokes. He was president of the Board of Education in Cleveland. And he took it as a personal insult that the NAACP would come in and attempt to desegregate the schools. Now, Arnold Pinckney was a friend. He was a person that I had a lot of respect for. I think he called the wrong shot in that case. Because when Frank Battisti, a white judge, had to tell Arnold Pinckney, a black leader, that the schools are segregated, that the segregation was not inadvertent, but it was intentional. I think that cost Arnold Pinckney a lot of problems. problems and probably contributed to him not winning the mayoral contest that he was engaged in. So I probably could go on, and I told Judge Groves that restricting me to 7 minutes is totally unreasonable.
We're gonna have a lot of time to talk more, for sure.
But in any desegregation effort, there are two issues that have to be addressed. One is whether or not the schools are segregated. That's the first issue. And the second issue is whether or not the segregation that exists is or was intentional. If it was intentional, then what is the remedy? A lot of people concluded that the remedy was worse than the disease. We can't possibly desegregate these schools because what will happen? Kids will have to be bused. Though in reality, students that attend schools at what's that school on 25th and Lorraine? St. Ignatius. Thank you. There's a St. Ignatius guy. I heard his voice. Students get there on a bus for the most part. Those that don't drive or have their parents that drive from St. Ed's, Hawken, Gilmore. People figure out a way, if at the end of the bus ride, there's a quality education. But we ended up having to fight not only the state and the Cleveland Boards of Education and the state and Cleveland Boards of Education in Columbus and Cincinnati, but we had to fight among ourselves to convince our people that separate was inherently unequal. It was then, it still is today. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. Dr. Mobley.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm so glad to be here. I always like to tell people my dad wanted me to go to law school, and I said no. But then I meet all of you all, and I think he was right and I was wrong. But in any event, I'm an English professor by training. I came back home to Ohio, born and raised in Akron, came back to Ohio in 2009 to be the inaugural Chief Diversity Officer at Case Western Reserve. And this topic actually was a topic for me before I took that job. I was at George Mason University for 19 years, and I met a Clevelander that many of you know. I met Diane McIntyre. And Diane McIntyre, the choreographer, had done a musical at my campus at George Mason University called Open the Door, Virginia. And this story came back to me recently when Reverend Otis Moss mentioned this case, mentioned the Prince Edward County, Virginia School District's response to Brown versus Board of Education. And I went up to Reverend Moss and I said, do you know that there's an Ohio counterpart to that story? I was a new board member, but I was a relatively new board member because I was on the search when she was hired. This is a wonderful executive director of Ohio Humanities. But in any event, I said to Reverend Moss, I said, there's now a film about it that I want you to see. I said, there's a counterpart in Ohio to what happened in Virginia. And what happened in Virginia is the young people were the marchers. Not their parents with them, but the young people were the marchers who said, you will not close our school and deny us our education. And so they later went to the March on Washington, and Reverend Moss recently told me this, that they were so proud that these teenagers came to the March on Washington because the elders in the march were proud of these young people. In the audience the night of the musical, there were students who said, this is what we had to do when they refused to let us get educated in Prince Edward County. They had to go to Maryland, they had to go to DC, they had to go to other school districts to get their education. So I don't want to get off topic here, but sometimes when you see the history of our people, you understand why people keep talking about reparations. You see the trauma that people experience as a result of people denying them what we all should have a right to, what we all should have access to. So when I got on this board and learned about this film, Melvin, I said, oh, I want to be part of that, because when you have been a beneficiary of all the work that Attorney Hardiman and others have been a part of. When you see that there's still work to do, you want to get involved. So one of the first things I did as the Chief Diversity Officer at Case Western was start a Power of Diversity lecture series. The first person I brought, I'm so proud of this, to this day, even though the brother's gone, but I loved him dearly, and that is Charles Ogletree's book, All Deliberate Speed. I brought him as our first speaker because my father was an educator, my mother taught it in Head Start. I learned to read 2 years before kindergarten, and so education is how I have become who I am. W.B. Du Bois talks about education and work are the levers that elevate a people. And so as a beneficiary of the education that my parents fought for, my parents were active in the NAACP in Akron, Ohio, Attorney Hardiman. And so I knew I wanted the students at Case Western, regardless of their racial background, regardless of their ethnic background, to know the battles that had been fought so that I could be an English professor at Case Western, so that I could be a Chief Diversity Officer. And he actually says in this book that this all deliberate speed was almost code for go slow. So that's what many school districts were dealing with, going slowly, trying to get away with as little as possible rather than desegregate. And I think one of the terms we may discuss here today is the difference between desegregation and integration in terms of intentionality. What is the intention? Is it about integration, which as a literature professor I used to hear people beat up on Zora Neale Hurston because her attitude was, I don't have to sit next to white people to know that I'm intelligent, to know that I'm smart. So if you get it twisted, you'll think the focus was on integration. The focus was on desegregation, giving people access to the best education possible. And the only one other thing I want to share is when I first came here to Ohio, back to Ohio after my education, before my PhD from Case Western, I taught at Shaker Heights High School. And so I believe at some point we're probably going to get to this, but the teacher in me brings books. And so the other book I brought is Can We Talk About Race and Other Conversations in an Era of School Resegregation. And so we have to talk about resegregation as we celebrate this documentary. We have to talk about what's happening now. And in the 70s when I taught at Shaker Heights High School, there were other parents who were activist parents. One of those activist parents, two of those activist parents were Reverend Edwina Moss. And I taught two of their children when I was a high school teacher. But one of the things that those parents had to do was say, wait a minute, how can it be that no black students are eligible for honors classes? How can it be that no black students are eligible for AP classes? And so as we talk about our progress, as we put this film in a historical context, we have to go back to what is happening in the recent past. And when I first came here, she's no longer at Case Western, but Dr. Rhonda Williams had just started the Social Justice Institute, and we had a conference where one of the young people at a high school here in Cleveland, I won't name the school, because the Lord told me just don't name the school, but at a high school here in Cleveland, this young lady stood up and said, the same thing that was in this film, Melvin, there are pages missing from my textbook, and no one seems to care. I'm a minister, so there's an expression in the Bible about gnashing of teeth. There should have been wailing and gnashing of teeth instantly. But people thanked the young lady for her remarks. She sat back down, and we went on with the program. So I'm saying this film, I think, inspires us to look at what is the situation our young people are dealing with in their schools right now, as we sit here. What's happening with them right now? What is the quality of education they're receiving, especially if their parents are not able to afford Hawken or University School or Laurel or some of the other schools? What quality, or, and people still say the Shaker schools are good. We're not trying to have that conversation today, but it's still a good school district. But I'm saying we need to look at what are the current fights. This film, for me, inspires me to think about what are the current fights that we need to wage if we're grandparents as I am, or great-grandparents as I am, and our children are grown, we still have children to care about. And this film inspires that kind of thinking for me. So.
Mobley, I just want to say, I know you said maybe you should have been a lawyer, but I want to make sure to point out, Dr. Mobley is one of the leading scholars of Toni Morrison in this country, and is really one of the reasons that we celebrate Toni Morrison Day, which was just last week. So I want to make sure that I point that out because you've made so many contributions in your career. So I'm glad you didn't become a lawyer.
Well, I am too. In fact, because I'm a Toni Morrison scholar, I brought another book. I brought this book. Zadie Smith actually wrote this. Toni Morrison only wrote one short story. It was called Recitative. And right smack in the middle of Recitative is a demonstration of mothers on opposite sides of the street holding signs. So she integrated into this little short story a Newburgh, New York, an upstate New York issue with parents marching with their children for desegregation. So thank you for reminding me. I normally lead with, I'm a Toni Morrison scholar. I have a book coming out in July. But Attorney Hardiman got me all excited when he mentioned all deliberate speed, so that threw me off. Thank you.
And we're going to come back to some of those other points that you touched on as well. So thank you. Dr. Melvin Barnes, please introduce yourself and talk to us. I mean, you know, given that you're the youngest person on this panel by far, you lived a different, you know, part of this history, but I would like you to speak about any of your personal experiences that you want to share, but also talk about the creation of this film and other aspects of this project, and what it's been like to really bring this history to light so that more audiences can learn about it.
Yes, so I guess I'm the youngest person. It's weird. I'm relatively young, but I feel very old. And given the comments that we've just had, I'm going to come at this from a slightly different direction. I'm the historian, or one of the historians on the project, but I'm going to start a little bit, you know, with my own childhood. So I'm from Toledo, Ohio, the son of a woman from Gary, Indiana, and my father is from Cleveland, right here, and I am a product of what we called growing up a predominantly white schools. We talked about that process of resegregation that took place in the wake of Brown throughout the 1960s, 70s, 80s, up until the 90s when I was attending school. And my family was one of those families that, as those resources kind of left the areas in which African American people and students had moved into, there was the following of those resources out to the suburbs whenever we could. So I went to school in a place called Sylvania. My family, and this is one thing that's really surprising to me, I learned later on, my mother had to borrow money from her boss at the adoption agency so that we could make the down payment on the home to get us into that school district. But they wanted to make sure that we went to a school that didn't have pages missing from the books. So they sacrificed to make that happen. And as I got older, I turned 18 and I began working at Toledo Hospital. And I remember talking to a family, and this woman looked at me and she said, "Melvin, do you remember integrating schools?" And I said, "No, I don't remember that at all." And she said, "That's right, because we did it for you." And that was one moment when it hit home to me that no matter sort of how old you are, everyone, in this room has a story, right? Has family that was involved in this process. And I became involved with the documentary when I joined the team in around 2020. And they asked me to take a look at the sort of current form of the documentary that they had produced a few years earlier, and sort of asked what was missing, what could we do to add to this. And I'm fresh out of graduate school, a newly minted PhD. And when I started learning about this story, because I had grown up in Northwest Ohio, but I had never heard of Hillsborough, let alone this court case. But things started to jump out to me that really hammered home how important this story was. We all learned about Brown, right? And sometimes we teach it as an end point. And it was everything moving towards that point. We all learn about the Montgomery bus boycott, but one thing that jumped out to me was that this was a civil rights action that began before the Montgomery bus boycott and ended afterwards. So I say that to hammer home the fact that these are people who are contemporaries of the people that we often learned about in school, of the Dr. Kings, of Rosa Parks. They were swimming in those same waters. So this is a story that immediately helped me to understand how important it was. And you know, we talked about all deliberate speed, and as I read through some of the way that the Supreme Court came to its decision in 1954, it became evident to me that there was vagueness in that decision, and purposefully, right? There was an understanding that this has been an institution that has been a part of the country for decades, and they did what they could to make sure that immediate integration didn't necessarily happen. There was an expectation that there would be time that was needed in order to make this change. But really that lack of guidance, what that meant was that every single town, village, city, corner of the country, people had to fight on the ground to figure out what that court case meant. If it wasn't for people who began to march and who began to say, no, this was the ruling, you have to live up to that promise, you know, that court case may not have had the same impact that we saw it have in the years after it. So, you know, it was just one thing that really jumped out to me when I began to study the history was the fact that these women were on the cutting edge of sort of making sure that that Brown decision wasn't lost and actually meant something around the country.
Thank you, Melvin. And just to add on to the work, so Melvin, and we have another scholar on our team, Dr. Aaron Rovin, who's working on this project, but it is really a team effort, and we have some of our team members back there. In addition to producing this documentary film, we also just published a children's book in partnership with Daydreamers Press called Step by Step, that tells the story of the Lincoln School Marchers from the vantage point of Joyce Clemens, who was one of the marchers and one of the plaintiffs in the case, the children. And then Melvin and Aaron are also working on a book for Ohio University Press and having a lot of conversations like this. So I just want to mention all of the other work that's going into it. It's been an incredible team effort.